Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Beth Horsington on behalf of the Strathmore Speaker Series. Thanks so much for stopping here today. In normal circumstances, we'd be holding this event at the Fire Barn in Onondaga Park in the Strathmore neighborhood, but COVID has necessitated the switch to Zoom. Fortunately, the Onondaga Free Library is providing the technical assistance we need to bring you this program, and that's technical assistance, technical knowledge that I don't have. The Strathmore Speaker Series is made possible through the generous support of the City of Syracuse, the Gifford Foundation, and the Greater Strathmore Neighborhood Association. Our guest speakers tonight are Liz Petrone and Ed Griffin-Nolan, local authors who have recently had their books published. Liz is a nationally acclaimed blogger whose book, The Price of Admission, is flying off the shelves and getting rave reviews on Amazon and the web. A true believer in the power of storytelling, Liz writes from a universally understood place of struggle and tells her stories with incredible honesty, humor, and insight. She and her husband live in the Strathmore neighborhood with their 4 children, and Liz works as a programmer analyst for a Syracuse corporation. Ed's book is Nobody Hitchhikes Anymore. Ed has hitchhiked across the US twice, 40 years apart, and chronicles his adventures as well as the way the country has changed in that time. He worked as a reporter and columnist for the Syracuse New Times for 30 years, and his work has been featured in many different occasions. He's currently a massage therapist at his spa at 500 in Syracuse. He lives in Pompey. When Liz and Ed have both finished speaking, there will be a Q&A session. And now, please welcome our first speaker, Liz Petrone.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mary Beth, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to the Onondaga Free Library. Fun story, my first real job was being a page in a library. I think I was 14. I just got to give you guys a disclaimer. If you have access to those employment records, don't look them up because I don't think I was very good at it.
But we won't put in your personnel file.
God bless the library for everything that you guys are doing. And the Strathmore speakers as well. You know, I've lived in Strathmore my whole life. And again, disclaimer, apologies to anybody who knew me as a teenager when I was growing up in Strathmore. Blanket apologies for anything I may have done or said. But I love this community. We've chosen to raise our family here, to be invested in the Syracuse City School District, to have our now second house in Strathmore. And I know how hard you guys work, how hard GSA works, how hard the Parks Department works. And I'm just so grateful to be here and be a part of this neighborhood, even when I'm not here doing this. And I have to tell you, when I knew that this book was going to be a thing, one of the things that I said to my husband was, oh my God, I hope they let me get to be a Strathmore speaker. So I'm super excited to be able to do this. I didn't envision it happening, obviously, during a pandemic. I thought I would get to be in the beautiful Fire Barn with all of you guys. But I guess I'm psyched that I only had to be presentable from the waist up, and we won't talk about what's going on under the camera. So a little bit about me, in addition to the things that Mary Beth said, and in addition to what you may know from knowing me. I am a mom of 4. I have a degree from SU in information systems, and I work in tech during the day. I'm a computer programmer. And then on the side, I have, what used to be this little blog that has since grown in a lot of ways, including into the book that we are here to talk about. And I'm going to just hold it up here. The Price of Admission. So I figured I'd start just by telling you how that came to be, how somebody who has a degree in tech and is a computer programmer and has no writing experience, wrote a book, has a blog, is known in some communities as a writer. And the way that came to be is basically loneliness, put it plain. So about 10 years ago, I had just had my 3rd baby, my daughter Gabby, which left me with 3 babies under the age of 5. And as any of you guys who have had children know, what that means is that I had absolutely 0 life. So I had a full-time job. I was raising 3 babies. I had nothing outside of work and family, and that left me lonely. And what we ended up finding out is that after Gabby was born, I ended up with postpartum depression. And I hadn't had postpartum depression with my first 2 children. So it took us a while to figure out that this was what was going on. And once I finally figured out that this was likely what was happening, I went back to my doctor, my OB/GYN at the time, and said, I think I'm struggling here. I think I might have postpartum depression. And he said to me, I don't know what you want from me here. I'm not a psychologist. Which I've told this story so many times, and every time I tell this story, I get madder. So I hope you're mad with me. It's an absolutely unacceptable response. I left the press. So. But anyways, I came home and I tried to figure out how I could find some community, and I was getting a lot of my parenting information and my family information from the internet because we had babies younger than a lot of my friends had, so we didn't know a lot of people who had babies in our social circle. And everyone on the internet just looked like so put together, so happy, so perfect. This was the what to expect when you're expecting days where, every article was the rules on, you absolutely must let them cry it out. You absolutely must not let them cry it out. You absolutely must introduce solids at 4 months. You absolutely must not introduce solids at 4 months. If you don't breastfeed, you're a beast. If you don't introduce formula, you're locking yourself down, whatever. So I sat down in front of the internet and I decided I'm just gonna write what's going on. I was late to the game to even have a social media account. My sister, who is younger than me and cooler than me, had kind of helped me set up a Facebook account. And I sat down on that Facebook account and I wrote this sort of blog entry about the fact that I was struggling with postpartum depression. And I figured, like my one aunt who has religiously always read everything I've written would read it, and, it would be a kind of a cleansing experience for me to get it out. But what happened is I started getting all these messages from people. So I got, comments on the post, but I also got private messages from a lot of people saying those 2 words that have really sort of become the anthem of everything that I've written and done since, which is me too. So people said, I've been there myself. I've loved somebody who's been there. I haven't quite been there, but I'm sorry. And almost immediately I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is community. It's not community in the sense that I had traditionally thought of it, but I saw it as this opportunity to connect and to truly connect, like to be able to tell the truth about some tough stuff, and connect with people right where they were at. So I started a blog. Nobody ever read it. There were probably like 100 people on my mailing list, and I thought I was, doing real well. But I committed myself to speaking the truth even when it was difficult. And then, a little while later, we lost my mother, and we lost her to suicide. And I've told a lot of people this, I think I might say it in the book too, that I feel like we lost her to a disease of silence. Meaning, had we done a better job, us as a family, but also we, as a broader community and society, had done a better job talking about things like mental illness and addiction, and depression and anxiety, maybe she would still be here. So the logical progression was I had this little baby platform. I wanted to speak openly about the things we hadn't been able to speak openly about while she was alive. It was too late to save her life, but maybe we could save somebody else's. And so I started to really speak about this struggle. And we grew, those stories seemed to resonate with people. And it wasn't just my mother's story. I am myself a suicide attempt survivor. I'm in eating disorder recovery. I struggle with depression and anxiety. So it's all of this. It's my story. It's her story. It's, I really think, a universal common story. And those stories seem to resonate. We built a community, and then eventually those stories became the permission came. And if this book is anything, you know, if I'm going to try to do anything with this book, it is to tell you there's nothing special about me. You know, this story, like I just said, I think it's universal. I think it's common. The only thing that's special about me is that I'm still standing here, maybe, or that I'm lucky enough to still be standing here. And the whole point is to encourage all of us to, you know, legitimize and normalize these conversations, these stories that are in this book, these stories that, you know, we've been having in the social media communities that I've been able to create, these stories that I've been writing about for a long time, but also these stories that people have been telling me for a long time. So with that, I'd like to just read you from the prologue of the book, which is kind of, you know, how everything starts. And this, I think, will sort of tie into what I was just talking about. So this is from the prologue, which is called The Decorative Apple. Let me tell you a story. I'm 16 years old, sitting in the kitchen with my mother while she makes dinner. And just for purposes of context here, let me also tell you a little about me at 16. I'm a mess. I'm drinking, I'm drugging, I just got my heart truly broken for the first time by my first love. I cannot bear to be in the same room as my mother most of the time, and honestly, I think the feeling is mutual. And I'm starting to feel things. Big and heavy adult things like pressure and inadequacy and pain and depression and anxiety. And I'm convinced I'm so amazingly special that I'm the only person on the whole planet who has ever felt these things. Basically, I'm out of my mind and terrified. And then on top of everything else, I've stopped eating, which at this point isn't even a conscious decision as much as it is a misguided coping mechanism. I certainly don't realize then that I'm probably starving myself in an attempt to slow down or even reverse time, to carve the new curves out of my body and keep me a kid a little while longer, where life felt simpler and less lonely. No, at this point, all I know is that obsessing over food in my body feels a heck of a lot easier than actually facing anything else I'm feeling. Anyway, so there I sat in the warm kitchen watching my mother make dinner. I'm sure I was supposed to be doing my homework or making something else, but I don't remember any of that. I just remember watching her, and God, was she a sight. If I was a hot mess, and I was, she was my opposite, fresh from her big job in a pursuit full of big shoulder pads and big diamonds. She'd been commanding rooms since well before I was born, and the kitchen was no different. It was hers, and I was a visitor, desperately trying to shrink myself into a corner. By then, things were tense between us most of the time, and in the kitchen, it was so quiet that the click of her heels on the hardwoods rung out like a heartbeat. "Are you okay?" she asked me, finally, probably weirded out by my staring. And isn't that the question right there? Was I okay? I was not okay, and I was sure that she could see that if she just stopped and looked, really looked at me, my dilated pupils and the hollows under my eyes from not sleeping, the way all the weight I'd lost made my clothes hang off of me, the protective way I'd hunch my shoulders around my heart and try to curl up into the smallest configuration of myself as possible. But I lied. I told her I was fine. Of course I did, because that's what we do, right? I'd already learned at 16 that in order to survive, in order to remain upright and breathing and presentable, I needed to hide some things, paint over some things, suck some things in and swallow some things down. Some things were to be avoided, food, truth, and others were to be flat out denied. So I let my chance go by and I lied. And instead of looking at her in the face, I let my focus rest on the kitchen table in front of me, and more specifically on the ever-present bowl of apples in the center of it. This bowl of apples was a fixture in our house, and they were not for eating. They were the best apples, the biggest, shiniest, roundest Granny Smith green apples, specially picked to sit in this blue bowl on the kitchen table, catching the evening light through the window and looking perfect. If you wanted to eat an apple, the ordinary ones for eating were in the fridge. It sounds ridiculous now to say, but just the way it was. And I was 16 and a mess and a kind of a jerk, and I decided right then that I was going to eat one of those decorative apples right there in front of my mother just because I could, because the air in the kitchen had filled with the smell of olive oil and garlic, and all I could think about was how I was just so hungry. isn't surprising. In every memory of high school I have, I'm hungry, except hungry probably isn't even the right word. It's more of a deep emptiness, a lack of something that goes well beyond food and even biology and edges itself up into this idea of not enough. It's an emptiness I will carry with me in some fashion for most of my life, an emptiness that despite all of the work and all of the wisdom, even now as an adult, the same age as my mother was in those kitchen all those years ago, I still carry. So I found the best apple, the shiniest and the roundest and the greenest of them all. I picked it up and turned it around in my shaking hand to find the best first bite. And just as I brought it to my mouth, it cracked clean in half in my hand. The two pieces fell open on the table. The inside of the perfect apple was rotten, brown, soft, mealy, and gross. I spent a long time looking at it lying on the table in front of me, smelling that sickly sweet fermentation smell, remembering how perfect it had looked on the outside, convinced there was a message there for me. And there was a message in there, all right, something big. It wasn't old enough yet or ready enough yet to get it, but I felt the edges of it tugging at me anyway. I looked from that rotten apple to my gorgeous mother, the heartbeat of her heels still clicking around the kitchen. It had looked so perfect. So, of course, we lost my mother to suicide 20 years later. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had had an honest conversation in that kitchen. Or if we, again, society, our family, community, were better able to have honest conversations at all. And I've been talking, you know, and I'm talking in that prologue about my mother, but the other truth is I went on to attempt suicide myself a few years after that moment in the kitchen, and I was unsuccessful, thank God, but I went on to try to hide the truth in so many other ways. Overeating, undereating, binge drinking, binge watching, binge scrolling, you know, and probably still my current favorite, which is just flat out denial, where we're like, it's fine, everything is fine, we're fine. And I could go on with that list, but, you know, I think you get the picture, or maybe you even see yourself, because I think this is kind of what we're all doing in some respects. You know, we're sharing these pictures of ourselves on Instagram that are filtered to highlight the absolute best scenes of our life, or our statuses on Facebook of what we've achieved, the highlight reel, you know, or even just the countless times we ask each other politely in the grocery store checkout aisle, or when we see each other walking in the park, how we're doing, and we say, I'm fine. When, you know, I think I could argue at this particular moment in history, very few of us are truly fine. And in some ways, I wonder if we're all decorative appling ourselves to death, chasing this unattainable image of perfection, while the world is literally on fire. And what happens, and why this is really dangerous, and why I'm passionate about it, is we end up then thinking that we're the only person that's dealing with whatever we're struggling with. And if I could tell you anything, you know, here right now in this moment, but also if I could tell you anything with this book, it's that is not true. You are not the only person. I hear from people, you know, just by virtue of being out there in this world, I hear from people every single day. People tell me their stories, or if they're not ready to tell me their stories, they just reach out and they say, listen, that resonated and I'm there. I hear those words, me too, every single day. And I hear them from people that you wouldn't think, you know, are the people that are struggling. So again, if I can tell you anything, it's we're all there. And I think, you know, we have this idea that if we see somebody put together, you know, who seems to have their life together, who seems to be a good parent, who is doing a good job at things, that they can't also be somebody who's struggling. And that is unequivocally not true. And I can tell you that because of these stories that I hear all day long. I think a good example of this is a woman I work with in my regular day job happened to read the book. And so her and I were on the phone, and we were on the phone for something work related, and she kept me on the phone and she said, you know, I have to tell you, if I hadn't read this book, if I hadn't been exposed to this other side of your life, I would have just thought you were a confident, put together, successful woman. And she didn't mean a single thing negative by saying that. I think she was being complimentary, but I was like, wait, let me stop you right there. Because I am a put together, successful, confident woman. I'm also a person who struggles with depression, anxiety. I'm also a suicide attempt survivor. I'm also in recovery for an eating disorder. I mean, these things, not only are they not, I mean, not only can they not exist at the same time, but they do. They do in pretty much everybody. I mean, it's different flavors of things, but, you know, I think, especially in our society, we don't do a really good job dealing with that idea that people can be nuanced and complex, and there can be duality going on at the same time. It's, you know, at the most base, it's simple things like, I love my kids to death, but they're driving me crazy. Like, those two things can be existing at the same time. Or right now during, you know, while everything is going on, the stress of everything is killing me, and I'm constantly complaining about it. At the same time, I'm so grateful that I'm healthy, that my family is healthy, that we have a roof over our heads, that we are able to work from home and, you know, still pull an income. They're not opposite ideas. They can live in the same person at the same time. And at the, you know, you take that all the way out, it's me losing my mom, you know, in this terrible, tragic way, and 3 weeks later giving birth to my son on my bathroom floor with nobody there but my husband to catch him, in what was unequivocally the most joyful moment of my life, all at the same time, you know. And that, I think, taught me more than anything that not only can we be experiencing both these things at the same time, but we all are. You know, it's my mother dying and people coming up to me in the receiving line, more than one person, many people coming up to me and saying, the thing I remember the most about your mother is her laugh. And she died, you know, from depression. We can be both. We are both. So with that said, I'm going to read you one more shorter piece on that idea. And if depression is the black and utter joy is the white, then maybe it's in the in-between where the colors are, where we can find sorrow and joy often coexisting right in the same moment. It's where most of us live most of our lives most of the time. Most of us don't find ourselves in the black and white of either or very often, nor would we want to. Usually we are both, nuanced, human. And once I accepted this, I started to see it everywhere, how I am both. I'm both, I need to get out of here right this second, and I hope you don't expect me to put that bra back on and go anywhere. I am at once, why do my friends never invite me places anymore? And, oh great, how am I going to get out of this one? I am, for the love of all that is holy, if one more person touches me, I will fall to the ground in a pile of cold ash. And somebody get over here and snuggle me already. I'm so embarrassed, my house is a disaster. And judge me, FedEx, I can dare you. I'm together sucking it all in until the day I die and proud of the beautiful belly I've earned. I'm both getting up early to do all the things and making love to the snooze button for 2 hours. I'm in 4-inch heels and big earrings, and I'm in bleach-stained sweatpants and fuzzy socks. I'm quinoa and bone broth and Whole30, and I'm chips and dip and caramel lattes and a 2 big glass of cold wine with ice on the front porch. I'm the woman who doesn't want vacation to ever end, and I'm the one who cannot wait to get back home. I've never been so tired, and I've never felt more alive. I'm the oldest I've ever been, and yet I will never again be this young. I'm a mom, and I'm still me. I'm afraid, and I am still doing it. I'm lonely, and I'm blessed. And sometimes my grief hangs heavy from my neck like a stone and drags my gaze down and away from the sun. And other times it shines like light through the hole in my heart, lighting the path ahead. I'm a mother, and yet I'm still her daughter. And she was all of these things too, both sides at once and everything in between. We all are, I'm pretty sure. And every time I sit down and say, this shit is hard, that's who I'm talking to me, to my mother, and to anyone else who feels like they must be the only one who doesn't know how to get themselves safely back to the other side. Because we need to talk about that side too. It's there where we can get real lonely if we're not careful, if we're too quiet, if we believe the lie that we have to choose between the light and the dark, and for some weird broken reason deep inside of us, we must have chosen the black. I kept my words inside far too long, and I regret it every single day, until they threatened to bubble up and over and couldn't be contained anymore and came out in a big rush of confessional honesty that was a lot like that recurring nightmare where you go out in public and realize too late that you're naked and everyone is staring. Also, speaking truth was the most freeing thing I'd ever done. It was both. When my mother was still alive, there was a time where we had to call 911. My sister had found her unconscious, and we called 911 and the ambulance came and they took her to the hospital. And when she woke up in the hospital, the first thing she said to me was, "Did the neighbors see?" And I think about that moment now, and it's so heartbreaking because I'm like, what if they did? You know, maybe she would still be here. And I think this book and this writing life and this blog and, you know, all of this stuff that I've tried to do with all of these truths is, at its most basic essence, me telling the neighbors, me telling you guys the truth, and hoping that in the process we can, again, normalize, legitimize these conversations, normalize struggling, normalize being both a successful woman and a person who's carrying the weight of a really hard past. So if there's anything that I can give you to take away from this, it is what I sign all my books with now when I sign it, which is, you are not alone. And with that, I will pass the mic, I think, to Ed. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Liz. I just wanted to tell everybody that if you buy Liz's book, I can make one guarantee: you will laugh and cry. If not on every page, at least with every chapter, maybe every other chapter. Do a lot of crying, do a lot of laughing. Anyway, I want to introduce Ed again because people might have tuned in late. Ed Griffin-Nolan is a professional, almost a professional hitchhiker. He's written 2 books about hitchhiking. This new book is called Nobody Hitchhikes Anymore. He's hitchhiked across the US twice, 40 years apart, and chronicles his adventures as well as the ways the country has changed in that time. He worked as a reporter and a columnist for the Syracuse New Times for 30 years, and his work has been featured in many different publications. He is currently a massage therapist, and he owns the Spa at 500 in Syracuse and lives in Pompey. Okay, and now I would like you to welcome Ed Griffin-Nolan.
Hi, thank you, Mary Beth, and thanks to all of you for coming into the Onondaga Free Library and the Strathmore Speaker Series, and all our neighbors in Syracuse for putting this together. And thank you, Liz. I've met a lot of you in the park. Some I got to know as parents or kids growing up and going to the same schools. Some of you I've met through parenting columns that I wrote for the Family Times, the Syracuse Parent, a long time ago. And then some of you I probably ticked off with something I wrote in the Syracuse New Times over the years. So I'm a transplant from Brooklyn and Staten Island. I've lived in Central New York since 1989, and I first set foot in 1978 at the on the trip that is the basis for the book Nobody Hitchhikes that we're talking about tonight. Disclaimer, I am not the Ed Griffin. If you think I'm the owner of Fleet Feet shoes, I'm not. That's the other Ed Griffin, although he is married to a lovely woman named Ellen, as am I. So we get mixed up a lot. And my wife, Ellen, is an artist and art teacher, and she did the illustrations for the book, for which I can't thank her enough. 1978 was the first year I set foot in Syracuse, and I got a ride from Utica in a Jeep with a respiratory therapist who worked at Upstate. And it was near the beginning of that summer-long hitchhiking trip that I took with my friend Joe. And that became the basis of the book. Now, I'm going to show you the journal that I kept. So when we left New York, we spent the whole summer in 1978, and I wrote down in this journal, which later survived a fire on Westmoreland Avenue. You can see the burn marks. And the name of every driver who picked us up, the hundreds of rides we got, how far they took us, from where to where, what we talked about, what kind of vehicle they drove. And I always would talk about this trip with people, and they would tell me, you know, you really can't do that anymore. That must have been fun. But
so I said I was going to do this again, and everyone said, you can't do that. It's too dangerous. Nobody hitchhikes anymore. And the only one who was enthusiastic about it was, suspiciously enough, my wife. So anyway, what happened on that second trip is the story that I tell in this book, Nobody Hitchhikes Anymore, that's just released. First, a little background. I have never hitchhiked in Strathmore, but I do know what it's like to stand outside my house by my truck on Parkway Drive, waving with one hand and holding jumper cables in the other, and being very grateful when somebody stops to offer to jump my truck. I know what it is to run into the home of a neighbor with my infant son and hand him off because my other son had gashed his head open on the stones that they used to jump from one to the other on those concrete cylinders over by the sprinklers, and run him up to community and to rely on my neighbor. And it's those moments, as Liz points out, where we really realize how much, in spite of our proud individualism, we really depend on one another. And if we're fortunate enough to live in a community like Strathmore, and I think a lot of Syracuse represents, and if we take the risk, we can totally depend on one another. This book, Nobody Hitchhikes Anymore, is kind of a road trip. It's a bit of an adventure story. It's also an attempt to find out if we as a people, as a nation, still can consider ourselves a community. It's a book about standing on the side of the road all across America and who you meet when you do that, and these totally random collisions and the amazing conversations and discoveries that happen. And the spoiler alert, this is a story of hope. I'm still alive. All the people, including a surprising number of police officers who thought this would end badly, turned out to be wrong. And that is the same hope that I found on the road, that I found on Parkway Drive when I lived there. Parkway is part of Strathmore, but it's not really. It kind of dangles off the edge of the park, down from the bottom of that hill that goes up to the Fireborn. It runs from South Avenue to Onondaga Park, and it's kind of from the poorest, one of the poorest neighborhoods in America, to this lovely park and one of the loveliest neighborhoods in the country. But if I were to stand there holding my sign saying nobody hitchhikes anymore, half the people who would pass me by would be Black and half would be white or Latino, and almost everybody would wave. It's the street where I raised my two sons, and today where my son Daniel lives with his partner Julianne. And Mike's book, last month we saw Mike Stripka give a presentation about his book, City on the Edge. And I really think of Syracuse as City on the Edge. I think he really nailed it. And Parkway is a teeter-totter street in a city on the edge. And every family that moves in or out, every house that gets painted or starts peeling, and every parent that either digs in and volunteers or gives up, every kid who graduates or drops out, I mean, every choice matters in a city like ours that's so precarious. We all matter, and that's one of the great beauties of living in a community like this. I think the theme that pulls these two books together is vulnerability. Right? Liz's book and her telling of the stories that she tells is far more adventurous and risky than, whoops, I'll tell you about that one later, than what I did, for sure. I think that to bravely commit to words and share with others the struggles, as personal as those things Liz writes about, that takes a lot more guts than sticking your thumb out on the side of the road. What I did love about the trip that eventually led to the book is this kind of reciprocity, that when someone opens their car door and lets you in, when somebody opens up about their story, it's just a magic. There's kind of a healing that starts to occur. There's a sharing and connections. It was in 1978 that my friend Joe and I took to the road. We got, in 2 months, we went about 10,000 miles in dozens and dozens of rides. I actually hitchhiked through Syracuse. I had my very first job interview on East Genesee Street, in the building where Geronio is today. And that trip really inspired me. And I hitched all over the world since. And but people kept saying that you could not do this safely anymore, that it was really a relic of a different time in a different country. There's too much fear now, or too much danger, people felt. So being stubborn, I decided to do it again. I made up this sign, and I got out there, and I basically walked out the door of my house in Pompey. I kissed my wife goodbye and said, I'm going wherever the road takes me. And my fellow hitchhiker, Sean Kirst, in the foreword to the book, says that back 40 years ago, there was just a lot more. Taking your thumb to the road 40 years ago was an easier task in a different America. He says there were a lot more cultural faith that the pilgrim with the backpack on the side of the road was not a threat. So we'll see what a threat I turned out to be. Erie, Pennsylvania. So I get dropped off the night before by a man named Carl near a McDonald's. He picked me up from a McDonald's where I'd been dropped off by Portia. And Portia picks me up and says she loved the sign. She's finishing up her shift at Denny's. She tells me she's celebrating 4 years sober today. All this in the course of about 10 miles. She, when she was a kid, she was in Texas and had a terrible family situation that had to do with addiction, and she hitched all the way back to Western New York. And here she is all these years later. She's absolutely ecstatic to be picking me up and driving me to the McDonald's near, I think it was Silver Creek, where Carl picked me up. So here's Carl. And I get in the car, the truck. It is a truck that would never pass inspection. It's a truck that's just so loud. And there's a reason why he's driving this truck. His motorcycle battery died. He prefers to drive his motorcycle. So he's silent for about 10 minutes. He's going to Dunkirk. Let me read from part of the story that I wrote about Carl. Once Carl gets talking, his story seizes hold of him. In between the sounds of slamming gears, rattling fenders, and the beeping of the cop detector, his sorry stories of how alcoholism and drug abuse have eaten up his family and friends fill the Jocelyn cab. As we blow through Dunkirk, he tells me of an uncle who took heroin mixed with the opioid carfentanil. That uncle is buried in a cemetery just across the road from the park, where he injected the drug for the last time as it happened into his neck. Carl's mom, he tells me, is on oxycodone for life, ever since her shoulder surgery. He asks me if I mind if he smokes. How polite is that? It's his truck. The windows are open. He lights up and then announces that he's driving me all the way across the state line to the town called Northeast Pennsylvania. I'm thinking if North Carolina's back roads get called Tobacco Road, Route 5, then Western New York should be named the Heroin Highway. Nearly everyone I met along that trip that divides Lake Erie vacation homes from the Appalachian-like towns just to the south seems to have been touched in one way or another by addiction. The industrial belt that began to rust when Joe and I were hitching through in the late 70s became the rust belt in the late 20th century and is now the opioid belt of the early 21st. Carl's uncle was one of the people who overdosed in a park in Dunkirk a year ago. On that one weekend, 8 people in Erie County alone died of heroin or fentanyl overdoses. In some cases, both. Without Narcan, it would have been worse. Medical examiners talk about hundreds of dead. Cops talk about thousands who would have died if someone didn't get there in time. And then there are stretches filled with the Walking Dead addicts like his mother who can be maintained but remain untreated, and guys like Carl struggling to make it, to keep ahead of the bills and the sounds of things all around him, things falling apart. Carl drops me in the town square of Northeast. I walk toward the interstate and pop into a gas station for something to drink. A bearded, tough-looking guy sees my pack, asks where I'm going, offers to take me the 6 blocks to the interstate. There's a quality in there, and I thank him. His name is Jim. He's waiting in line at the register, tells me to put my pack in his truck. I'll be right out. I walk out toward the gas truck pumps. The sticker on the back of Jim's truck reads, "No one ever burned a flag at a gun show." Probably accurate, I think to myself. I climb into the seat, wait for Jim. In 6 blocks, I didn't expect we would have much time to talk about guns and such. I'm just grateful for the ride. But in that intimacy that comes from being in a confined space for a finite period of time, Jim and I have just met, he chooses to tell me unsolicited that he quit drinking 33 years ago when his first child was born. Good for you, Jim. Now at the motel bar, waiting for a pizza and a pair of Sam Adams, I find myself surrounded by this circle of Klanspeople getting ready to organize a bonfire for that night, Confederate flags included. And them mistaking me for one of their kind, I heard some amazing and threatening racist dialogue. And back to my room, and when I wake up in the morning, I'm a little more than concerned about the town, the nature of the town I found myself in. Remember, this is 2018. As soon as I get up on the ramp, my phone rings, and it's Marnie Eisenstadt of the Post-Standard. And just as she asked me, "Who picks you up on this trip?" Lydia stops, and her 4 kids. And they drive me all the way across town, tell me all about their plans for the day there, headed to the zoo. And when they drop me off, my next ride is from Morgan. Morgan's a young mother who's planned to take her daughter Harmony to the Children's Hospital next week. Like Carl, she's only going a few miles, but instead she takes me all the way across the state line to Ohio. I'd like to read you a little bit about Morgan's story. Morgan is one of the tribe. At the age of 15, half her lifetime ago, she had to get out of Texas. Her father had fallen back into serious drug abuse, and she couldn't take it any longer. All she wanted to do was to get to Pennsylvania to be with her grandmother. The 2 kinds of people picked her up, families and truckers. The families wanted to keep her safe. The truckers turned out to be friends of her dad. Even in the depths of his battle with addiction, he put the word out to his friends on the road. They watched out for his little girl when he could not. She thumbed all the way to Texas, from Texas to Erie without letting her grandma know she was coming. On the way, a lady named Lisa from Wheeling, West Virginia, stopped with 3 kids in the car. She gave Morgan a ride to a Walmart where she had to do some shopping. "You can wait outside the car or you can come in with us," Lisa told Morgan. Roadside stops force hitchhikers and their rides into a delicate dance. Some degree of trust has been acknowledged by the very act of riding in the same car. Do you know that your bond is based more on hope and faith, a cosmic collision, than on verified experience? Like any new relationship, it is untested and fragile. Whether you're stopping for gas or to just use the bathroom at a rest area, you don't want to let the other person out of your sight. Your mind plays tricks, dancing between hope and conniving when you're all alone out there on the road. And on that West Virginia day, 15-year-old Morgan told Lisa she would wait by the car. She could keep an eye on her bags and make sure no one came along and drove the car away. So Lisa locked the car, took the kids, daisy-chained hand in hand, across the parking lot, and disappeared into the retail monster. Morgan walked around, always keeping the vehicle in her line of sight. It was about half an hour, which felt 3 times as long, before the mom and the kids returned, dragging a bunch of plastic bags. "Here, honey." Lisa handed Morgan a bag of stuff, a pair of sneakers, a sweatshirt, t-shirt, and 2 pairs of jeans. She had sized Morgan up the way only a mother can, and bought her clothes to replace the skimpy things Morgan was wearing. "Honey, it's cold up there in Erie. You can't go to Pennsylvania wearing your Texas clothes." Our worst fears, I learned again and again, usually turn out to be nothing more than fears. Mother Lisa probably had her own story of kindness. that she was paying forward, and now Morgan was paying that kindness forward by picking me up. And it kind of went like that from Kent, Ohio to Peoria, Illinois, across Nebraska, into Colorado and over the Rockies. And in most cases, one person after another picked me up. In most cases, they told me stories. And if they asked, I told them mine. Well, Sean Kurtz was nice enough to write the foreword to this book, and he says in there that there is a heartbreaking backdrop to the story, which I'll tell you, tomorrow will be the anniversary of the day my granddaughter Caroline was born, which is also the day that she died. There are no easy answers. There really isn't even a word for the parent of a child who dies at birth, nor a word for a parent who watches his child suffer that loss. We have a brick by the lake with her name on it, and aching hearts full of love and children's toys never played with, but we have no easy answers. That might help us to understand why people are tempted by easy answers. Like Liz says, we just have our stories, and we have to tell our stories. So that's a big part of mine. But what I found every place I went was people wanting to tell their stories. And also I found pieces of the place I was taking with me. In Peoria, I heard about Caterpillar company pulling out of town, like Carrier had left Syracuse. In Craig, Colorado, I walked past hundreds of garage sale signs as people tried to figure out what to do as the coal plants were shutting down. And all I could think of was the Southern Tier in Pennsylvania. You know, might remember 2018 as kind of a politically charged time. And maybe it is, maybe it wasn't, but as I looked at the literature of the road, Phil Caputo in was it 2009, I think, traveled from Key West, the Arctic, all the way through Alaska and wrote about it, The Longest Road. Great book. And it was the time of the rise of the Tea Party, and he was very concerned to find out, do we have a thing anymore that we can call us? And that was a question I had, but I saw it in a different way. In 1978, I remembered mostly the guy who picked me up in Oklahoma City, took us on his motorcycle to his house. We're all on the road sometime. This is the opening of my book. Gray nodded, turned his cycle around, and rode off to start the workday. The offhand remark had been Gray's response when I tried to thank him. The night before, this stranger had collected me and my best friend Joe from the Oklahoma roadside and ferried us one at a time to his home, supplied us with pizza and beer, and let us camp in his backyard. Then he shuttled us back to the road in the morning. I've forgotten a lot of things since that summer of '78, but those words have stuck in my head. We're all on the road sometime. 40 years later, wanting to believe that Gray's words still held some truth, I took off again to hitchhike across the United States. And, asking myself the question, is the road still out there? This book is my report. It includes cops and cuffs and canyons, ramps and snakes and lightning, rednecks, hobos, forest rangers, info wars, gun racks, young mothers, an old widower, meth heads, pothead survivors, moonshine, a Tex-Mex trucker fresh out of federal prison high on Jesus. In short, lots of stories. The road, I found out, is still out there. It is a place with possibilities and frustrations in limited supply. The bigger question 4 decades later is this one. Is there still a thing we call we? My question, I went, are people still out there like the ones that took us in and drove us and fed us back in 1978? So 15 days in, I'm riding in the back of a state trooper's cruiser after being frisked and cuffed. Trooper Mejia Stevens drops me at the Routt County line, leaving me a good 15 miles from the nearest town. See if I can find that slide. Bear with me here. There it is. He picked me up near where an electrical engineer named Ron had left me. Ron was planning to drive all night to do a favor for one of his daughters. And toward the end of the hour or so we spent together, he mentioned that his wife had died suddenly after surgery, very young. So Ron drops me off, the trooper picks me up, and the trooper leaves me in the middle of nowhere. We part ways. I hoist my pack and I start walking west. It is a gorgeous setting, just perfect if you happen to be a snow leopard. Beneath the trees, a good foot or two of snowpack remains in place where the spring sunshine is yet to penetrate. Peaks covered in snow frame the landscape. There's no truck stop. There's nothing here but elk and moose, clouds, a few remaining hours of daylight, and me. Uncuffed, deep in the mountains of one of the whitest states in the West, I have to ask myself the question that anyone with a web browser and a heartbeat must be thinking in this summer of 2018. I wonder how this experience would have gone, how I would feel right now, and where I would be spending the night if I were a black man. I have a good time to think about that. I walk for an hour or more, wondering if the sun will last or if I can handle a 3-hour hike to Steamboat. I put one foot in front of the other, leaning into the hill. And then along comes Naz. A white Camry stops. The passenger door swings open. "I don't feel well." Those are her first words. "Do you want me to drive?" "No, just get in." And I did. Naz lives by herself in the mountains outside Walden. A few months ago, doctors removed her appendix. It's hurting today. Fearful it might be an abscess or worse, she makes an appointment at a clinic in Steamboat for tomorrow morning. She holds her stomach with her right hand and drives with her left. She's not sure it will hold till the morning. "Maybe I should drive you to the ER?" She isn't sure. Up and down the mountains, she narrates the contours of her discomfort. We talk about the mountains. She's 69 years old, lives alone. She isn't sure who would come if she took ill. The little clinic in Walden can't treat serious illnesses, but Naz doesn't want to miss school tomorrow. She's about to retire. It's supposed to be her last day on the job, and after decades in the classroom, she doesn't want to miss the last day of classes. And she weighed all that against the chances of dying alone in her cabin. Instead of calling the ambulance, she starts up the Camry, drove across the Rockies, and picked up a hitchhiker on a stretch of highway so empty and so beautiful it might as well have been on the moon. A few miles from Steamboat, she allows that maybe she's feeling better. I've always had a turbulent relationship with the concept of karma or its pop Christian sibling, the notion that there is a powerful God who provides everything we need. Whether they come from the East or West, such notions seem to imply that we can't handle ourselves in this world, or that somehow when things go south, we get what we deserve. On this mountain, I knew exactly what I needed: a ride to Steamboat and a place to sleep. Naz needed someone to settle her down in the face of pain and a surging fear of what might be going wrong inside her gut. In a larger sense, I needed a lot of things. I needed Caroline to breathe and for parents' tears to cease. I needed my country to stop shouting long enough to see the harm we were doing to the world around us. Naz talked a lot about her son. It seemed that she needed to know that he loved her. We found each other out there on the road, just west of Rabbit Ears Peak. I don't think it was karma, a result of some kind gesture I chose to make in my past. I don't think it was God putting Naz in my path the way Ricardo, a writer from earlier, believed that Jesus had told him to stop for me back in Ohio. I think it was Naz who made that choice because she was feeling vulnerable and wasn't afraid of that feeling. And I realized that I was out there for much the same reason. I live on a vulnerable planet, in a vulnerable country, in a vulnerable family. All of us faced with choices and in a culture that tells us day and night, in person, online, on film, and TV, to shut that vulnerable part down and put on a brave front to the world. Naz chooses in an exposed and powerless moment to expose herself even further. I'm doing the same, and in that predisposition, we find a kinship. I think about the trooper who had left me at Rabbit Ears. He had all the power. He had his gun, his car, his radio, his shield, all his blessed procedures to protect himself. He even had handcuffs to deploy on a harmless guy old enough to be an AARP member. He had the power to drop me off where he chose, which wasn't a great spot. Naz had nothing. She had only her fear and her pain and her freedom. She was hurting. On the other side of the mountain, barreling toward Breckenridge, my earlier ride, Ron is trying to salve his open wounds by doing a kindness to his college-bound daughter, and by some strange roadside coincidence to me. He knows, Ron and Naz both know by some instinct that there is something to be gained, possibly something salvific, in taking a chance and stopping for a stranger. Ron found someone to talk with. Naz found company to reassure her that she would make it across that mountain pass alive. Both found something more. They found in themselves what they were hoping for a reassurance that despite all the calamity and pain that rakes through our lives, with a planet in peril and a madman at the helm of great power, we can still find one another along the way. I had found the road. It still exists. And whatever that human instinct prevails, I think with satisfaction, the road lives. And so on we went to Craig, Colorado. And on the last night, oh, and then to Salt Lake, where, believe it or not, a guy named Jeff picked me up. And 40 years ago, outside that same Denny's, a guy named Jeff had picked me up. And then Will, with his little dog, Itsy Bitsy. Will lives in a trailer in Utah. His wife died recently, and he can't sleep. And when he sleeps in a trailer in his yard, and when that doesn't work, he gets in his van and he takes the little dog that his wife cared for, and he drives, and he picked me up. And he was going to Winnemucca and headed north. He went right through Winnemucca and drove another 3 hours to get me to San Francisco, where my niece lived. And it was the end of that part of the trip. And what's been interesting is connecting with people like Will after through social media. We didn't talk about the things in real life that we talked about in social media. We might not really have as pleasant a conversation if we had gone in that direction. But on the road, there was something that brought us together, a shared need that we felt. And I would love to do it again. In COVID times, I'm not going to be getting in anyone's car. I'm not going to ask them to get me in their car. I was going to hitchhike last spring when the epidemic started, and that's on hold. So here I am on Zoom, asking you for a ride and your patience and kindness in listening. And I thank Liz and Scott and everyone from the library and Strathmore. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ed. I will start off with a question. What is the final slide there that you teased earlier, but we didn't get?
Oh, there you go. Well, everyone asks me, who was my favorite person? And I'm not supposed to have favorites, but the gentleman on the right here, his name is James, and he's from Kentucky. And when he picked me up, and I loved his attitude toward life. He's like, "You're from New York? I've never been to New York. I have a whole bunch of questions." And he didn't ask questions to make a point. He asked questions because he really wanted to know the answer. He asked me about how people here feel about guns. He asked me about what we like to eat. He asked me, "Do you all hate Muslims?" Thinking like a lot of people that we're all from New York City. And I told him about my family, where my cousin died in the World Trade Center, and my brother-in-law is Muslim. No, we do not like terrorists, but we do not hate Muslims. And he just listened. He took it all in. He told me about the Mexican workers who worked. He's a tile mason, and the respect he had for these people. He listened to their stories, and it just seemed like such a valuable experience of somebody who really had an attitude. Then he told me he never finished high school. He got his GED. He's a tile mason, and he's all the while spitting, chewing tobacco, telling me about his moonshine recipe. He describes himself as a hillbilly from eastern Kentucky. And he says that he got himself on the school board in his town. Where's this going? Why'd you get on the school board? And it turns out he got on the school board because they were cutting the arts program. He didn't like that idea because he's a tile mason. And he's like, I'd just be a guy with a sack of chisels if I didn't have a good art education. And so I really like that. So anyway, I gave him a sticker that my friend Jess Novak gave me. It says, "Counting on Love." She's a great singer and songwriter, and she wrote this song. And I was handing out these stickers as I went. And he goes into the truck and he pulls out this sticker. "Don't be a dick." He says, pretty much the same thing. So that was my buddy James. Yeah. Still talk to him.
I have a question for Liz. Liz, you're muted, but my question is, did your mother ever get therapy? Did she ever get professional help? And did you, or was your writing, was that your therapy?
The answer to both is yes. I don't want to, like, my mother was diagnosed a couple times as bipolar, and I think because of the associated stigma with having a mental illness like that, she didn't want to treat it, it's funny, I had a conversation with the guy that is the head of the Child Mind Institute in New York City recently, and he asked me that same question, and I gave the answer that I just gave. And he said if people understood that in most cases with mental illness, the average IQ is lower than average. But with bipolar, the opposite is true, and that the average IQ is higher. And if you look at people who have bipolar on a map, they're all sort of clustered, not all obviously, but many are clustered along the coastlines, because that's where the cultural centers are, and they're often drawn to creating art. And so if, we talk about the stigma, like the stigma associated with mental illness, but if we truly understood this illness, I think the stigma could potentially be very different. And one of the great tragedies, I think, of her life is that she didn't want to own that. And then for me, I've definitely had therapy. I'm actually, since the pandemic started, back talking to my therapist. And I have to be very careful, and I want to be very careful with the work that I do in the writing, to not sell this as a substitute for professional help, because it's definitely not. I think everybody would benefit from telling their truth in some way, but you don't benefit from telling your truth in the middle of your pain. I don't think, that's a very vulnerable place to be. You don't want to speak necessarily to the world about the wound while the wound is open. Like when I sat down and started writing, 7 years ago when my mom died, the version of this book that I wrote, because I was in pain, was angry and sad, and I was a hero and a martyr, and all that stuff needed to come out, and I'm glad it came out, and that was part of my healing journey, and I think that's probably a healthy thing to recommend to many people. I'm also glad that it came out and went directly into the garbage, because if that was out in the world, I'd be pretty embarrassed, and I don't think it would be very helpful for many people. So, I mean, professional help, absolutely 100% is where it's at. And I think there's not a person I know that wouldn't benefit from that. This is just me, trying to give my perspective on what helped me with my grief. And we think about grief like loss of a loved one, like death, but there's probably never been a better example of collective grief than right now, right? I mean, we've all lost so much. I mean, there's people obviously who have lost loved ones due to the pandemic, but we've lost our sense of safety. We've lost our sense of normalcy. We've lost our traditions and our routines, and all of that stuff needs to be grieved. So processing any of that stuff, I think telling your story or telling the truth or finding a way to do that when you're ready is a great tool in the toolbox, but it certainly doesn't replace professional help.
Fellow author Mike Streisga asked, he says, sorry, just scrolling back to it. He says, you are such a wonderful writer. Which writers have inspired you?
That's a really good question. And I think it's funny because like my favorite author in the whole world is Stephen King. So it couldn't be more different than what I want to write myself. But I've been reading books since I was old enough to read, and I've read every single night before I went to bed. It's a ritual for me, that is carried, probably one of the only things that is carried with me for all of my life. And I think it's that like voracious consumption of stories that has inspired me to, like, logically, when I sat down and said, okay, I'm lonely, I want to communicate and find a community, that was the logical next step, was to tell my story, because I had been reading people's stories my whole life. And I'm, as any of you guys who know me, a naturally introverted, kind of awkward person. And so being able to control the narrative and speak that way, it seemed like a natural progression. But like right now, ever since the pandemic started, I've only been able to read psychological thrillers because it's the only thing that will hold my attention long enough, you know, because everything is just so crazy, and I'm here, I'm working from home now. My kids are all here. It's just bonkers in my house all day long. So a psychological thriller that's like super absorbing is like basically what I can do right now when I'm not reading Michael Streisku's book, obviously, and Ed's book. But I don't read a lot of the stuff that I write. I don't know. I feel like maybe I would be sad if I read stuff that was written way better than I can write. So I'll stick to the blood and gore and walk around going, is that person a murderer? Is that person a murderer?
All right. That's, on that note, I am going to go to Kathy Margray. Kathy, I apologize if I've murdered your name there. And she's going to ask a question for Liz.
Hi, Kathy.
Oh, Kathy, you just gotta unmute yourself. I will unmute you. Oh. Okay, go ahead, Kathy.
Hello, Liz.
Hi.
Yes, very proud of you. And
Thank you.
I think for the therapy, the ability to self-medicate and to then become the normal person that you want to do is something that your mom was able to do. And so the therapy was there and all the advice in the world, and she still found her way to do her thing. But when she barged into my classroom one day to have me proofread and rewrite and redo her message or her speech or her whatever it was to at Holy Rosary that day for Mrs. Kerrigan, she so spoke to the fact that what you leave behind and how horrible it is for those who, you know, are depending on you, and now you have left them. And so I thought, okay, that's something that we'll never have to deal with because she has such a message for everyone. And so, you know, I remain mad and sad and in a quandary over it, but she would be very proud of you being able to do, of course, what she couldn't do was express what was going on with her. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. That's beautiful. And I mean, for you, those of you guys who don't know, Kathy and my mother were very close friends. A lot of love there. I think I would add to what you're saying that it's been such an unbelievable gift to be able to take the pieces of a painful story and sort of pull them apart and put them together in a way that kind of makes it make sense or makes it feel like it had a meaning. And that's the gift that is being able to write about your life, I think, is, you know, while this stuff is all going on, obviously you're not sitting there, you know, finding the deeper meaning and beauty in these moments. I mean, I was in a lot of pain and a lot of us were, but to be able to go back and dive into that pain and instead pull out of it moments of absolute beauty and joy, and to be able to hopefully tell a story about a wounded woman who was also so many other things, you know, beautiful and successful and dynamic and a good friend and a good grandmother, you know. I think it's a gift. And it's part of the reason why I encourage people to try to tell their own stories, is because it gives you a little bit of power over a situation where you probably felt, at least I did, powerless. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
Great. So let's see, does anybody else have any questions? Let's see if I missed anybody on the way up there. If anybody else has, oh, I see Kathleen, you have your hand up one more time. So I'm going to throw it over to you one more time, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Kathleen, and ask your question. Go ahead, Kathleen. Yep.
I was wondering who his favorite ride was. You know, he had a lot of old people, and I know he had a lot of exciting interactions, but I wondered who his favorite was.
There was a guy I met in Kentucky, and his name was James, and he was riding with his friend TJ, and they picked me up. And I just love this guy because he asked questions and wanted to know answers. He dropped out of high school, went to play baseball in Florida. When that played itself out, he came back and he became a tile mason. And he's really good at it, actually. His employer sent him to Italy to this ancient tile masonry school. But he would just turn, he'd say, he's one of the guys who drives and looks the other way, and he's got one hand and he's spitting tobacco into a bottle. And he says, so everyone in New York, they hate Muslims? No. And I told him, you know, my story. I have a family member who died in a trade center. I have a brother-in-law who's Muslim. And he said, okay, I get that. And then he said, what about the guns? So he just wanted to know everything about how people in a part of the world that he hadn't been. And, you know, it just taught me again, it reminded me again that the categories that we use to judge one another, just they're not worth shit. You know, he said to me, well, I got myself on the school board. I'm like, whoa, what is this? He called himself a hillbilly. And I said, I wonder what this hillbilly got himself on the school board for. He got himself on the school board because they were cutting the arts program. He didn't like that. He's a tile mason. He's like, what's a tile mason without a good sense of design, right? It's this guy with a sack of chisels. And he, you know, so he just like was constantly as he was going. And he told me about trips he'd taken out west and Native Americans that he'd met and the conversations he had with them. The Mexican workers that he worked with, because Kentucky is very dependent on immigrant Mexican labor. And he just got to know these guys. He just asked them questions and he thought about them and he ate their food. And so I had a lot of hope for James, that maybe there are more James out there than we know of, and that it certainly calls me to check my tendency to stereotype or categorize anyone. You know, just because there's one aspect of you that I might know, I shouldn't assume that I know all the others.
Does anybody else have any other questions or anything? If not, I am going to throw it over back to Mary Beth.
Okay. Thank you, Liz and Ed. It was a great night, and you know, despite our technical difficulties, I can't wait to read Ed's book. I've already read Liz's. I'm going to read that again pretty soon. Anyway, I just want to tell you about our lineup for 2021. Keep in mind that our programs are always on the second Thursday of the month. So the year will begin with Thursday, January 14th. PSF Professor Hyatt Green will be our speaker. He is leading the COVID-19 wastewater monitoring project for the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County. And that's a really amazing, different kind of science. So you'll want to tune in for that one. He'll be followed on Thursday, February 11th by Suzanne Mettler, who is a professor of American Institutions and Government at Cornell. She'll talk about her recently published book, 4 Threats, The Recurring Crisis of American Democracy. You can find updates on the series at our website, strathmorespeakers.com. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again in January. And I think we're going to have a screen up at the end that'll tell you where you can get Liz and Ed's books. Okay, there you go. Night, everybody. Thanks a lot.